which is very important, the IPR, because that was the beginning for the manufacturing setup to come up in India. Industry will also provide employment which is more stable. Entrepreneurial growth in India happened only after 1991. The small scale industry was definitely a very big boost for the Indian economy. Industrial development was one of the core contributions for GDP development. Good morning and welcome to the third session of Indian Economy 1950 to 1990. A very interesting format and a very interesting topic altogether, because now we are going to see some of the most important factors that had led to the development of the economy. So just let's try to understand the topics for today first. These are the topics for today. So we have quite a number of lists in the topic: industry and trade, market and state for Indian industrial development, very important for us to understand. Then we have the industrial policy 1956, which is very important, the IPR, because that was the beginning for the manufacturing setup to come up in India. Followed by the small scale industry, not to forget, a huge employment generation, and that led to a revolution in terms of job, in terms of manufacturing. Trade policy, the imports and exports, what we have been talking about. Effects of policy on the industrial development factor, the drawbacks, and the license Raj, which is not to be forgotten, because that is the crucial point that led to the liberalization altogether that we will be discussing later. But then these are all the core factors, these are all the crucial factors that actually led to a different scenario of economic growth altogether. So quickly moving forward, let's first try to understand the industry and trade sector of India. Economists have found that poor nations can progress only if they have a good industrial sector. Now, was India a poor country? Was India a country which did not have enough economic growth? The answer was definitely an yes. Why? Because once we got freed from the hands of British, we did not have much of wealth. All the wealth has been drained by the Britishers. So this led to a scenario where India was lagging behind in terms of the poverty factor. So that was the reason why economists started saying that at some point of time, India has to make a progress, has to make some sort of improvement by investing in the industrial sector and start manufacturing at larger scale altogether. So for the economic development of any country, it is mandatory and it is important that we start working out on the industrial segment or the industrial growth altogether. Industry will also provide employment which is more stable, because large scale industries will have constant work and they will be able to give a constant source of income to the people, and because of that this will also be an alternative to agriculture. Now there might be a lot of youngsters in our country who are not interested to take up agriculture because they have studied in different lines in different disciplines and they want to test their abilities and skills in the manufacturing sector. They are probably the younger generations who have understood the technology and they want to see the implementation of technology. So industry provides a great platform for all these youngsters to come up on board and start developing their skills altogether. So industry is also a source of modernization and overall prosperity. It is one of the major reasons that the 5-year plan was developed, and we kept in our mind that in every 5-year plan we will try to increase our industrialization, we will try to increase our growth sector altogether. Now moving forward, market and the state in industrial development altogether. The big question that was facing the policy makers was that what should be the role of government and the private sector in industrialization. As I told you in my previous sections, the concept of PPP, that is private-public partnership, was a very big question that was running in the mind of the policy makers, running in the mind of the planning commission. So what exactly the government should do? How should they participate? Is it only the public sector, or is it only the private sector, or the combination of both that will enable the growth of the economy? Because if you start understanding the economic growth, there was an immediate assistance and need that was needed, that was generated, that could help them in order to develop the sector altogether. That was mandatory, because that was becoming a core part, that was becoming an essential part altogether in order to develop this particular sector, that was needed in order to promote the growth altogether. At the time of independence, Indian industrialists did not have the capital to invest. So you could see that the private sector was not having enough efficiency in terms of the capital growth, enough efficiency in terms of finance. They were lacking the capital, they were lacking the financial aspects, and so it became on the government of India and the public sectors to lead the industrialization altogether. That was another reason why you would see that entrepreneurial growth in India happened only after 1991. We did not see much of entrepreneurial growth happening in the industrialization sector or the trade and industry sector, primarily because most of the people were not having the access to capital. They did not have the access to benefit and facilities. So the period of 1950 to 1990, priority was given to the public sector, and the public sector became the core source for the economic growth to happen altogether. So with that priority in mind, most of the policy makers now wanted the government to also become a part of the system. They also wanted the government to start involving in terms of growth, in terms of development. They wanted every single organization, be it private, be it the government organization, should participate for the overall economic development. Now, moving forward, Industrial Policy Resolution of the year 1956, we call it as IPR. 1956 is very important year in the Indian economy, because in accordance to the 5-year planning, in accordance to the plans that we had set in the mind of the state controlling the companies, the heights of the economy, because when government started establishing the organization state-owned corporation, we had bought in this policy, and the resolution that was adopted by the government was that we wanted to try to build industries on the basis of socialist pattern of the society, which means to say that government started building up the industries or started promoting public sector companies for the benefit of all. Government wanted to see that in each and every state, every citizen had the opportunity to participate, had the opportunity to be a part of the system, where they would be able to go ahead and they would be able to see that they are connected, they are able to grow in terms of job, in terms of employment altogether. So that is why it is mandatory for most of the people to understand that the priority was given to the public sector altogether. Now, moving forward, the resolution of the IPR, the industrial policy factor, was that it was classified into industries of 3 categories. So the IPR's ideology was that we wanted to categorize the industry in 3 segments. The first segment would be the industries which are owned by the state. That means the state-owned corporations might be like starting from LIC, starting from the steel plant of India, or looking into BHEL, all these kind of companies which are state-owned corporations, which are public sector companies altogether. The second category of industries in which private sector control and supplement efforts could be brought in with the state factor. So there were companies which were developed in the state of Maharashtra and Gujarat with the support of public, with the support of the government, but these were all private companies, starting from Tisco, starting from Bajaj, starting from Mahindra and Mahindra. All these kind of companies had a little bit of public support, but yet they were privately owned companies. They also helped in the economic development, they also helped in the employment process altogether, and their sole responsibility for starting new units. So they were given the opportunity in order to start up with the new units and start growing further. The third category consists of the remaining industries which were in the private sector. Now, when I say the third category, I would like to use the word allied industries altogether. So if you understand the allied sector, these were primarily those small companies which were trying to support either the government or the private organizations. In 90% of the case, allied industries are one which were trying to support the mainstream private organization in terms of productions and promotion. So this was one company, or this was one sector where the government did not give necessary emphasis or support because they were small companies and they needed support in order to grow. Moving forward, the next factor was that in addition to this, the units, there were certain units which were given concessions such as tax benefit, electricity at a lower tariff, and the purpose was to bring in the regional equality. Now, why did the government give all these benefits? Was that because they wanted the people to understand that when they start getting into the concept of manufacturing, when they start getting into the factors of growth, by giving them some benefits, they would in turn contribute for the nation's GDP. So the private players were given concession because they would be able to make use of the benefit and in turn contribute to the national income altogether. Plus, the private players could also play in the regional equality factor by providing jobs to the people living in that state. Now, for example, Bajaj Auto Limited, which is located in the state of Maharashtra, was one of the primary employers providing employment to millions of people in that particular area. So that is how, if you start an industry, a private industry in a particular state, that industry itself would become an employer and would be able to generate employment for thousands of people living in that area. License to expand production was given only. Now that word, license itself, is one of the protocols and regulations that you need to keep in mind, and it was given only if the government was convinced that the economy required for larger quantity of goods. So that's where government wanted to bring in a control and say to the people that I will give you the permission to expand only if you are going to do some benefit to the economy. I'm not going to give you an open bracket license or an open cover saying that whenever you want you start it and you just keep moving forward. The ideology here was very clear because we wanted the government to understand that economy can be built, economy can be developed only if there was necessary support, only if there was a necessary expansion that could develop the system altogether. Now, moving forward, in 1955, before we start understanding the small scale industry, we need to understand a very, very small growth process. That is, in the year 1955, the Village and Small Scale Industries Committee, also called as the Carvey Committee, noted that the possibility of small scale industry actually trying to revive the economy. Now, the small scale industry in India is a sector which is not much explored during the time 1950 to 1990. Reason is that government was only trying to concentrate on the public sector, on the large scale industries which could provide massive employment and big level benefits altogether. But the government was not trying to understand the growth and economy in terms of the small scale sector. So a small scale industry was defined with reference to the maximum investment that was allowed. Again, in India, we understood the concept concept of small scale industry defined by the factor called as the investment limit. So typically when we started looking at the small scale industry, their investments were less than 5 lakhs. So any unit at that point of time could start with just 50,000 rupees to 1 lakh rupees. They could just start out and they would become a small scale industry trying to provide some employment, and they were trying to improve the economy overall. Now moving forward, it was believed that the small scale industry as a factor of growth was also more labor intensive, and they used the large scale industry in terms of their support factor. So if you look here, the small scale industries are labor intensive. So that means they needed a lot of people who could work for them, which in turn would become a supporting feed to the large scale industries altogether. And therefore, they could generate more employment. That is why Government of India was very much interested in the small scale industrial development. They wanted to see that by helping that small scale industry, by allowing them to grow to the next level, automatically employment can be generated in India. So the small scale industry will definitely do the job of providing employment to all those millions of people living in the rural sector, who in turn will go ahead and start helping those large scale industry. These industry could not compete with big industrial firms, definitely not. Just by the sheer size and by the production capacity, small scale industry could never be compared to that of the large scale industry. So there was a challenge, but what was required here is that the small scale industry was definitely a very big boost for the Indian economy in terms of improving the employment and the consumption factor altogether. Now, the trade policy, import substitution. If you look at this, technically this strategy is called as import substitution. Why? Because this policy was aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic products. Now, if you look at any of the foreign products, be it an electronic gadget or cars or any kind of thing, we wanted to see that if we could replace that imported product with a domestic product. If in India we could manufacture a pen, if we could manufacture a handbag, or we could manufacture a shirt or a pant, whatever is that, then we would be able to replace that import factor. We don't have to depend on those foreign countries. We don't have to import their goods at a higher rate. So which means we would become self-reliant, and we would also start providing employment to the people, because they will start getting involved in the production. The policy of protection, that's why we are going with this factor, was based on the notion that industries of developing nations are not in a position to compete with developed nations. So at that juncture, if you start looking, India was not in a position to compete with USA or with UK or with China, Russia or any other France or developed nations, because we were a small country and we were struggling in terms of economic development. So in that condition, if we start importing, that means we have to pay more money for the same product, and India did not have sufficient revenue to start taking in all those factors. So that is why we wanted to substitute those imported goods with the domestic goods itself, so that we will be able to see that growth happening on a regular basis. And we always wanted the growth to be on a regular, on a stipulated basis, phase by phase manner. So that is why this trade import policy was brought into factor. Next, the effect of policies on the industrial development. Because of these policies, the proportion of GDP contributed by industrial sector from the period that was 11.8% in 1950 to 51 went straight up to 24.6. So just look at the growth, 11.8 to 24.6 in just 40 years that we had done it. Of course, that was a very great achievement for us. Why? Because if you look at it, we have doubled ourselves every 20 years. In every 2 decades, we have almost doubled ourselves, and we went up. And that was the reason why the rise in industry shares of the GDP factor made a very, very important progress. So industrial development was one of the core contribution for GDP development or the GDP progress in India. The 6% annual growth rate of industrial sector during that period was commendable. Why? Because we maintained an average and we started progressing with that, and we also believe that every year on year, we need to contribute an X percentage and start moving forward. So that was the reason why the industrial policy, the industrial growth actually made a difference altogether, and that was needed at that juncture for us because that could make the GDP grow at a higher rate. The promotion of small scale industries gave an opportunity to people who did not have employment, who did not have any factors of growth, and who actually helped in terms of generating larger employment scale. So it was mandatory for most of us to understand that at any given point of time, this industrial development led to the economic growth of the nation. Now, moving forward, we start understanding that many of the drawbacks that happened in the industrial sector. What was the drawbacks? Many of the public sectors incurred huge losses. Government was not able to continue, but still government tried to kept on investing on the public sector in spite of the factor that there was not much of performance, there was not much of production. So that was actually making the government task impossible to the close, where government undertaking was not able to generate revenue, and the government has to keep on pumping money for the survival of these industries. So that's a very, very bad scenario that you could probably see here, because the nation's limited resources was completely consumed by this non-performing industry. The need to obtain license and to start an industry was misused by many people, by many startups, and they believe that that was the necessity, or that was one of the kind of conditions or options that was available for them to make money. So they will just take a license, start a new company, but there was no progress or no contribution made by them towards the economic development of the country. So this also led to some sort of worry or drawbacks in the system of economic development. Now, moving forward, the other factors that we are going to talk today is the license Raj, one of the most important things. The excessive regulation of what came to be called as permit license Raj prevented certain firms by becoming more efficient. This was very, very important. Because of the license factor, we were not allowing the industries to open up and come forward. Now, for example, automobile sector itself could have become even more revolutionized, even more modern before 1990, but unfortunately, government was not giving them the license, government was not giving them the permission to open up and come up. Insurance sector, we did not have much of facility. The government did not give any sort of belief or forwarding nature because of the license Raj that happened altogether, and that was one of the reasons why we were not able to move forward altogether. More time was spent by the industrialists in order to obtain a license. They spent that time in lobbying rather than concentrating on the production factor altogether, and that led to a downturn, that because of that license Raj, we were not able to overcome the barriers, and we felt that we are always stuck with the government and we are not concentrating on production overall. Now, moving forward, we come to the conclusion of the session, saying the factor that what are the things that actually led for the growth. So after independence, the most important thing that we learned is the socialism. We wanted to adopt a socialistic government, a socialistic approach in development altogether. So we all believe that socialism will lead to growth altogether. So that's why we brought in a mixed economy model where every single person will get involved in terms of growth. All the economic planning has been formulated through the 5-year plan. That was the most interesting factor, because using a 5-year plan, we created a benchmark, we set a goal, we set a milestone, and we started progressing all together. Common goals of the 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-sufficiency, and equity. These are the 4 factors I want you to keep in your mind: growth, modernization, self-sufficiency, and then equity, because these are the 4 factors that actually helped India to make a rapid progress. The major policy initiatives were of course taken in the field of agriculture and industrialization, because both of these sectors needed a great amount of concentration, and that actually made a lot of development for the progress of India. Now, moving forward, we also understand the proportion of people depending on agriculture did not go ahead exceeding and did not decline as expected. There was a growth that was happening, and the policy initiatives in industrial sector raised its contribution. Because of the policy factors, because of the importance given to the industrial sector, automatically there was a huge growth that took place. One of the major drawbacks in the industrial sector was the functioning of the license Raj, which stopped most of the industries to outperform their own performance. At the same time, if you start seeing that the government started giving more emphasis to the public sector, that was one of the reasons why the sectors in terms of the private areas had to fall down, had to come down altogether. But not to forget, the amount of industrial policy initiative actually sowed the seeds for growth and development, and that lead to the overall economic progress. So in a nutshell, the Indian economy started blooming from the year 1950 to 1990, and afterwards we started making rapid strides of progress, and we became one of the most industrialized nations in the world. With this, we come to the conclusion of today's chapter. Thank you for joining me on this wonderful session. I believe that the session was highly interesting, informative, and educative. Please understand the concept of this Indian economy from 1950 to 1990. It is important both from an exam standpoint, also from the economic development standpoint. Thank you once again for joining me tonight.